The great crystal dome of the Galactic Council was huge and bright. It could hold millions of beings from across the galaxy. Today it was packed full with representatives from every known species. The air buzzed with different languages and strange sounds. Some aliens made clicking noises while others hummed like machines. Energy beings floated near the ceiling while rock creatures sat heavy on special platforms. Ambassador Deho walked slowly to the center of the massive hall. His black shoes clicked on the smooth crystal floor. He wore a simple dark suit that looked plain next to all the colorful aliens around him. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard like steel. He had been doing this job for 10 years and he was tired of it. The human section was tiny compared to other species. Only 12 seats for all of humanity, while the bird-like Veltari had hundreds of representatives. The rock people, called Theronians, it took up an entire section with their massive body. Even the new species that joined last year got more seats than humans. Day-Ho stopped in the center circle and looked up at the thousands of alien faces staring down at him. Some had multiple eyes. Others had no eyes at all but sensed him in different ways. A few species were just floating balls of light that pulsed with different colors when they were angry or excited. The head of the council was called the Prime Conductor. It was an ancient being made of pure energy that had lived for over 10,000 years. When it spoke, its voice sounded like beautiful music mixed with the sound of stars burning. But today that musical voice was cold and harsh. The Prime Conductor began to glow brighter. This meant it was about to make an important announcement. All the other aliens went quiet and waited. Deho knew what was coming. 3 months ago, humans had asked for equal representation in the council. They wanted their voice to count the same as other species when important decisions were made. It was a simple request that should have been easy to approve, but the aliens had spent 3 months laughing about it. The Prime Conductor spoke, its musical voice that everyone could understand through translation devices. Every species in the galaxy had these small machines that turned alien words into their own language. The ancient being announced that the human request for equal representation had been denied. Again, for the 15th time in 50 years, the reaction was immediate. Aliens across the chamber started making sounds of approval. The Veltari flapped their golden wings and screeched with joy. Their leader was a proud female named Zixera, who had always hated humans. She stood up on her bird legs and pointed one wing at Day-Ho. Her voice was high and sharp like broken glass. She spoke through her translator device, so everyone could understand her insults. She called humans baby species who had only been traveling in space for 200 years. She said they were primitive apes who barely knew how to use fire when her people were already building crystal cities among the stars. She laughed and said humans should be grateful that the council even let them sit in the same room as their betters. Other aliens joined in the insults. The Theronians were huge rock creatures that looked like walking mountains. Their leader Grokthor had arms as thick as tree trunks and a voice that sounded like an earthquake. He rumbled that humans were weak, soft things that would break if you touched them too hard. He said his people were born warriors who had conquered dozens of star systems, while humans were still hiding in caves on their little planet. The aquariums were next. These aliens looked like giant jellyfish that floated in tanks of special water. They pulsed with angry red colors as they spoke. Their leader said humans were too stupid to understand the deep wisdom that came from living for thousands of years. Humans lived such short lives that they died before they could learn anything important. Even the plant people called Sylvans rustled their leaves in disgust. They grew like trees but could walk and think. Their leader was an ancient oak-like being who said humans were destroyers who cut down forests and poisoned rivers. How could such creatures be trusted with important decisions that affected the whole galaxy? The insults went on for over an hour. Every major species took turns explaining why humans were too young, too weak, too stupid, or too dangerous to have equal rights in the council. Deho stood in the center of it all and never moved. His face stayed calm even when aliens called his people monkeys or parasites or worse things that the translation devices could not properly convert into human words. But inside his chest, his heart was beating faster. Not from fear, but from anger that had been building for 50 years. Anger at being treated like children when humans had contributed so much to galactic civilization. Anger at being dismissed and ignored when they tried to help solve problems. Anger at watching other species take credit for human innovations and discoveries. The worst part was not the insults themselves. The worst part was that many of these aliens owed their lives to human technology and human knowledge. But they had forgotten this or chose to ignore it because it was easier to look down on the young species than to admit they needed help. Finally, the Prime Conductor called for order. The musical voice rang out across the chamber and all the aliens went quiet again. The ancient being announced that the discussion was over and the human request was officially rejected. That was when Deho smiled. It was not a happy smile or a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made smart people very worried because it meant someone had just made a terrible mistake and was about to find out exactly how terrible it was. Deho reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket. Every alien in the chamber watched as he pulled out a single piece of white paper. It looked so simple and harmless, but somehow the entire massive hall went completely silent. He unfolded the paper carefully and held it up so everyone could see it. The silence was so complete that you could hear the quiet hum of the crystal dome and the soft breathing of thousands of different species. When Deho spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the huge chamber. He did not shout or get angry. He just spoke in the same calm tone he had used for 10 years of trying to work with these people. He said the paper in his hand was humanity formal withdrawal from the Galactic Council. Effective immediately, all human representatives would leave the council chambers and never return. All trade agreements between humans and council species were cancelled. All joint research projects were ended. All military cooperation pacts were void. The reaction was explosive. Aliens shrieked and roared and flashed angry colors. Some jumped up from their seats while others released chemical smells that meant extreme distress in their species. The Thronians pounded their rocky fists so hard the floor shook. The Veltari flew in circles screaming insults, but Deho kept talking in his calm, quiet voice that somehow cut through all the noise. He said humans had tried for 50 years to be good members of the galactic community. They had followed every rule and respected every tradition, even when those rules were unfair and those traditions were stupid. They had asked only for basic fairness and equal treatment. Instead, they had been treated like pets begging for scraps from the table. They had been called names and laughed at and ignored when they tried to contribute. They had watched other species take credit for human discoveries while simultaneously claiming humans were too primitive to have opinions. So humanity was done with all of it. The prime conductor finally managed to restore some order. The ancient being pulsed with colors that meant shock and confusion. In its musical voice, it said that humans could not simply leave the council. There were procedures to follow and obligations to consider and treaties that had to be honored. Deho folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. He said all procedures had been followed and all obligations had been considered. Every human colony in the galaxy had been notified of the decision. Every human ship and station and research facility had received new orders. As of tomorrow morning, humanity would have no official contact with any council species. No trade, no cooperation, no communication. The council wanted to treat humans like they did not exist, so now they would get their wish. For the first time in the 10,000-year history of the Galactic Council, a member species had simply walked away. And as the aliens looked down at the calm human in his simple black suit, they began to realize that maybe they had made a very big mistake. 3 months had passed since Ambassador Deho walked out of the Galactic Council chambers. At first, the aliens had laughed and said good riddance to the troublesome humans. They thought life would be easier without those annoying creatures, asking for equal treatment all the time. They were very wrong. On the massive trading world of Nexus Prime, merchant ships from across the galaxy sat empty in their docking bays. The great markets that used to buzz with activity 24 hours a day were now quiet and almost deserted. Strange smells filled the air as exotic foods rotted in storage warehouses that nobody could afford to buy from anymore. Merchant Princess Hyojin sat behind her enormous desk in the tallest tower on Nexus Prime. She was one of the richest humans in the galaxy, and she had built her fortune on one simple truth that the aliens had completely forgotten about. Humans were not just customers who bought things from other species. Humans were the ones who made everything work better. Her office had windows that looked out over the entire trading district. Usually she could see thousands of ships coming and going at all hours. Alien traders would be running around making deals and loading cargo and arguing about prices in dozens of different languages. The docking platforms would be full of strange creatures from every corner of the galaxy. Now most of the platforms were empty. The few ships that were still working looked old and broken. Many of them had patches on their hulls where human repair techniques used to keep them flying. Without human maintenance crews, these ships were starting to fall apart. Hyojin turned away from the window and looked at the screens covering one wall of her office. Numbers scrolled past showing trade volumes and market prices and shipping schedules. Every number told the same story. The galactic economy was collapsing faster than anyone had thought possible. A soft chime told her that someone wanted to enter her office. She pressed a button on her desk and the door slid open. Her assistant Minho walked in carrying a data pad and looking very nervous. Minho was young and had only been working for Hyojin for 2 years. He was smart and learned quickly, but he had never seen anything like what was happening to the galaxy. He stopped in front of her desk and bowed politely before speaking. He told her that another delegation of Veltari traders was waiting outside. They had been coming every day for the past month. Each time they offered more money and better terms for any kind of trade agreement with human merchants. Each time Hyojin told them the same thing. She looked at Minho and shook her head. She told him to send the bird people away just like yesterday and the day before that. There would be no trade agreements and no business deals and no technology sharing. Humanity was closed for business with all council species. The Volt had been the loudest voices calling humans primitive and worthless. Their golden-feathered leader Zixera had stood up in the council chambers and screeched about how humans were barely evolved apes who had nothing to teach the galaxy. Now the proud bird people were learning a hard lesson about human contributions to their civilization. For over 40 years, human engineers had been quietly improving every piece of Veltari technology. Their beautiful crystal ships that looked like flying palaces were powered by fusion cores designed by human scientists. The weapons that protected their empire were guided by targeting systems created in human laboratories. Even their magnificent crystal cities were kept at comfortable temperatures by atmospheric processes invented by human technicians. Without human support, all of this advanced technology was starting to break down. Veltari ships were losing power in the middle of space. Their weapons could not hit targets anymore. Their cities were becoming too hot or too cold as the climate control systems failed. The same problems were happening everywhere across the galaxy. The massive rock creatures called Theronians had built their mighty war fleets using metallurgy techniques that human scientists had developed. The special alloys that made their ship armor so strong were created using human knowledge of molecular engineering. Without human metallurgists, the Theronians could not repair their ships or build new ones. The Aquatic who lived in vast underwater cities were facing an even worse crisis. Their ocean worlds were becoming polluted as the water purification systems broke down. These systems had been designed by human environmental engineers who understood how to keep huge volumes of water clean and safe. Without human technicians to maintain the purifiers, the Aquarian oceans were slowly turning toxic. Even the ancient energy beings called conductors were having problems. These creatures had no physical bodies but existed as pure consciousness made of organized energy patterns. For thousands of years they had been stable and unchanging. But recently some conductors had begun to lose cohesion and fade away. The quantum mathematics that helped them maintain their energy forms had been developed by human theoretical physicists. But the worst crisis was happening on the agricultural worlds that fed most of the galaxy. Human farming techniques had completely revolutionized food production over the past 50 years. Earth plants that had been genetically modified by human scientists were now growing on hundreds of different worlds. These crops could grow in alien soils and survive in different atmospheres while producing much more food than native plants. Human agricultural engineers had also developed new farming methods that could increase crop yields by 3 or 4 times. They had created fertilizers that worked on alien plants and irrigation systems that could adapt to different gravity levels and weather patterns. Without human farmers and scientists to maintain these systems, food production was dropping rapidly across the galaxy. Some worlds were already experiencing shortages, others were facing the possibility of complete famine within the next year. On the planet Kepler 438b, which was one of the major food producers for the Veltari Empire, a crisis meeting was taking place. The local governor was a proud bird creature named Velkorn who had always looked down on humans as inferior beings. Now he was staring at reports that showed crop failures across his entire world. His agricultural advisors were panic-stricken. They had no idea how to maintain the human-designed systems that kept their farms productive. The genetically modified earth corn that fed billions of Veltari was dying in the fields. The automatic irrigation systems were breaking down. The soil treatment facilities that kept the ground fertile were shutting down one by one. Velkan had sent desperate messages to other Veltari worlds asking for help, but every world was having the same problems. Across their entire empire, food production was collapsing because they had no idea how to maintain the human technology they had come to depend on. The governor finally swallowed his pride and tried to contact human agricultural experts. But every message came back with the same response. Humanity was no longer providing support or advice to any council species. If the Veltari wanted help, they would have to ask their own experts to figure out the problems. The trouble was that Veltari experts did not understand human agricultural science. They had never bothered to learn how the systems worked because they assumed humans were too primitive to create anything truly advanced. They thought the improvements were just lucky accidents or simple modifications of existing Veltari technology. Now, they were discovering that human farming science was incredibly sophisticated and complex. It involved advanced genetics and soil chemistry and atmospheric processing and dozens of other fields that the Veltari had never studied. Seriously, similar scenes were playing out on worlds across the galaxy. Alien governments that had spent decades insulting human intelligence were now frantically trying to understand human technology. Scientists who had dismissed human research as worthless were desperately studying human technical manuals. Military leaders who had called human weapons primitive were analyzing the wreckage of Therenin ships that had been defeated by human naval forces. Back on Earth, President Soyoung stood before the cameras in the Capitol building. She was addressing not just the people of Earth, but humans living on colonies throughout the galaxy. Her words were being translated into dozens of languages and broadcast to every human settlement from the core worlds to the frontier territories. She spoke in a calm, clear voice about the situation developing across the galaxy. She explained that many alien species were now experiencing serious problems because they had become dependent on human expertise without realizing it. For 50 years, humans had been quietly solving problems and improving systems and making life better for billions of alien beings. The aliens had taken all of this for granted. They had assumed that their technology was naturally superior and that any improvements were just minor adjustments. They had never acknowledged human contributions, or given humans credit for their innovations. Now that humans were gone, the aliens were learning the truth. They had not been teaching humans how to be civilized. Humans had been teaching them how to solve problems they could not handle on their own. President Soyoung made it clear that humanity had no intention of returning to the Council or resuming cooperation with species that had treated them with such disrespect. The galaxy was welcome to try managing without human help. As reports continued to pour in from across the galaxy, it was becoming obvious that this was not going to. Admiral Taemin stood on the command bridge of the human battleship Soulpride, watching the massive Therenin war fleet approach through the darkness of space. The alien ships looked like floating mountains made of dark rock and glowing metal. Each ship was 3 times larger than the biggest human vessel, and they moved in perfect formation like a pack of hunting beasts. There were 50 Therenin warships in total. Their hulls were covered in thick armor plating that could supposedly withstand any weapon in the galaxy. Plasma cannons the size of skyscrapers jutted out from their sides, ready to unleash devastating firepower. These were the ships that had conquered dozens of star systems and defeated every enemy the Therenins had ever faced. The Therenin commander was a massive creature named Grok Magnus, who stood over 3 meters tall and weighed as much as a small vehicle. His body was made of living rock that had been hardened by centuries of battle. Scars from ancient wars crisscrossed his chest and arms. His voice sounded like an avalanche when he spoke through the communication systems. Grok, who had come to Earth with a simple message for humanity. The humans would return to the Galactic Council immediately and resume their duties as a minor member species. They would provide all the technology and expertise that the galaxy needed to function properly. If they refused, the Therenin Empire would crush them like insects and take what they wanted by force. The rock giant was absolutely confident that this would be the easiest military campaign in Therenin history. Humans were soft, weak creatures who had never fought a real war. They lived short lives in fragile bodies that could be broken with a single blow. Their ships were small and looked flimsy compared to the mighty Therenin dreadnoughts. What Grok did not know was that humans had been preparing for this moment for over 30 years. Admiral Taemin was 55 years old and had spent his entire adult life studying alien military tactics. He had analyzed every major space battle in galactic history. He had studied Therenin weapons and armor and ship designs until he knew them better than most Therenin engineers. He had also been working with human scientists and engineers to develop new weapons and defenses that no alien species had ever seen before. The human fleet that faced the Therenins looked much smaller and weaker. There were only 20 human ships compared to 50 alien dreadnoughts. The human vessels were sleek and smooth, while the Therenin ships were bulky and covered in spikes and armor plating. To most observers, it looked like a hopeless mismatch. Lieutenant Yuna sat at the weapons control station monitoring the approaching enemy fleet. She was 28 years old and had trained her entire career for this moment. Her fingers moved across the control panels with practiced ease as she prepared the human ships for battle. She reported to Admiral Taemin that the Therenin fleet was demanding immediate surrender. Grok Magnus was broadcasting threats and insults in his rumbling voice. He called humans cowardly parasites who had hidden behind the protection of stronger species for too long. He said the Therenin Empire would show them what real warriors looked like. Admiral Taemin almost smiled at the threats. The Therenins were making the same mistake that all the Council species had made for 50 years. They assumed that humans were weak and primitive because they looked different and acted differently than the older alien races. The Admiral opened a communication channel to the Therenin flagship. His voice was calm and polite when he responded to their demands. He told Grok Magnus that the human fleet was not interested in surrendering or returning to the Council. He suggested that the Therenins turn around and go home before anyone got hurt. The reaction from the alien commander was explosive. Grok Magnus roared with laughter that sounded like boulders crashing down a mountainside. He said humans were even more foolish than he had thought if they believed their tiny ships could threaten the mighty Therenin war fleet. The rock giant gave the humans 30 seconds to reconsider their position. After that, his ships would open fire and reduce the human fleets to cosmic dust. He seemed to think this was very generous, since most enemies did not get any warning at all before the Therenins attacked them. Admiral Taemin counted down the seconds while his officers prepared for battle. When the 30 seconds were up, he gave a simple order to Lieutenant Yuna. He told her to show the Therenins what human engineering could accomplish, when it was not being held back by Council regulations and alien prejudices. The Therenin ships opened fire first, just as everyone expected. Their massive plasma cannons lit up the darkness of space with beams of superheated energy that could melt through solid rock. The weapons were incredibly powerful, but they were also slow and clumsy. It took almost 10 seconds for each cannon to charge up between shots. That was their first mistake. Human ships moved like dancers compared to the lumbering Therenin dreadnoughts. While the aliens relied on thick armor and brute force, humans had developed advanced propulsion systems that could change direction instantly. Human ships could accelerate and decelerate and spin and dodge in ways that made them almost impossible to hit with conventional weapons. The human vessels scattered in all directions as the plasma beams passed harmlessly through empty space where they had been just moments before. Not a single human ship was damaged by the opening barrage, even though 50 alien cannons had fired at once. Then the humans showed the galaxy what they had been working on in secret for decades. Human weapons were completely different from anything the Council species used. While aliens built huge, slow-firing cannons that took forever to aim and reload, humans had developed rapid-fire particle beam systems that could strike multiple targets simultaneously. Each human ship carried dozens of these weapons that could fire continuously without needing to recharge. The particle beams were not as individually powerful as Therenin plasma cannons, but they were much faster and more accurate. More importantly, they were designed specifically to disrupt the energy systems that powered alien technology. Instead of trying to punch through thick armor, the human weapons attacked the electronic systems that made enemy ships function. The battle began in earnest, as human ships darted between the alien dreadnoughts like wolves attacking a herd of enormous but slow-moving prey animals. Particle beams lanced out from every human vessel, striking Therenin ships in precisely calculated locations. The aliens quickly discovered that their thick rock armor was useless against weapons designed to overload electrical systems rather than cause physical damage. Human particle beams passed right through the armor plating and attacked the delicate computer networks that controlled everything from engines to life support systems. One by one, the mighty Therenin warships began shutting down as their control systems failed. Their weapons stopped firing as targeting computers crashed. Their engines went dead as power distribution networks overloaded. Their communication systems failed as electronic warfare programs invaded their networks and deleted critical software. Watched in growing horror as his invincible fleet was systematically disabled by the small human ships. His own flagship was shaking as multiple systems failed simultaneously. Emergency lights flashed red throughout the command center while his officers shouted reports of cascading failures across all ship systems. The rock giant tried to contact his other ships, but the communication network was completely down. Could see through the viewports that most of his fleet was drifting helplessly in space, with their engines dead and their weapons silent. Some ships were spinning slowly out of control while others hung motionless like enormous metal tombstones. Admiral Taman opened a communication channel to the disabled Therenin flagship. His voice was still calm and polite when he addressed the alien commander. He explained that all 50 Therenin ships had been completely disabled but not destroyed. Human weapons were designed to neutralize enemies without unnecessary killing. Because humans believed that war should have limits, he told Grok Magnus. That rescue ships were already on their way to collect the stranded Therenin crews. The aliens would be returned safely to their home worlds along with a message for their government. The Therenin Empire was welcome to try attacking humanity again, but the results would be the same. The entire battle had lasted exactly 17 minutes from first shot to final surrender. News of the impossible human victory spread across the galaxy at faster than light speed through quantum communication networks. The Therenins were famous throughout known space as the ultimate warriors who had never lost a major battle in over 1,000 years of conquest. Now they had been utterly defeated by a species they had considered weak and primitive. On Earth, civilian Genesio watched the news reports with his 8-year-old daughter Mina. She was smart for her age and understood that something very important had happened, even though she did not know all the details. About space battles and alien politics, she asked her father why the aliens had been so surprised that humans could win the fight. Genesio thought about how to explain it in words she could understand. He told her that the aliens had made the same mistake that bullies always made. They thought being big and loud and mean made them strong. They never learned that real strength came from being smart and working together and solving problems instead of just breaking things. The Galaxy War. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was unlike anything in their 10,000-year history. The great crystal dome that had once echoed with proud speeches and arrogant declarations now trembled with desperate pleas and frightened whispers. Representatives from across the galaxy sat in their assigned sections, looking smaller and more vulnerable than anyone had ever seen them before. The mighty Therenin delegation was the most shocking sight of all. These proud rock warriors who had terrorized the galaxy for centuries now sat with their massive heads bowed in shame. Their leader Grokthor looked like he had aged 100 years in the past month. Deep cracks ran through his stone skin where stress had literally broken his body. His voice shook like a minor earthquake. When he finally stood to speak, he told the assembled council about the complete defeat of their war fleet at the hands of human forces. 50 of the most powerful warships in Therenin history had been disabled in 17 minutes by 20 smaller human vessels. Not destroyed because humans were apparently too civilized to kill unnecessarily, but disabled so completely that the ships had to be towed back to Therenin space by rescue vessels. The other council members listened in stunned silence as Grokthor described human weapons that seemed to ignore conventional defenses entirely. He spoke of human ships that moved like living creatures instead of mechanical objects. He admitted that everything the Therenins thought they knew about warfare had been proven wrong by creatures they had dismissed as weak and primitive. Dr. Yunji sat quietly in the human observer section, listening to confession after confession from species that had spent decades insulting her people. She was not supposed to be there since humanity had completely withdrawn from the council, but the alien representatives had begged her to attend this emergency session. They hoped she might be their bridge back to human cooperation and forgiveness. She was 62 years old and had spent 30 years as Earth's chief science advisor before retiring to write books about galactic history. She had watched the steady decline in human treatment by council species over the decades. She had seen promising cooperation agreements cancelled because aliens did not want to share credit with humans. She had witnessed brilliant human scientists dismissed from joint research projects because their ideas challenged alien assumptions about how the universe worked. Now she was watching those same aliens panic as their civilizations collapsed without human support. The Veltari ambassador stood next to speak. Zixera had once been the most beautiful and proud of all the bird people with golden feathers that shone like captured sunlight. Now her feathers were dull and gray from stress and malnutrition. Her crystal cities were crumbling as quantum stabilizers failed one by one. Her people were living in primitive shelters while their magnificent technology slowly broke down around them. She spoke in a voice that cracked with emotion about how wrong the Veltari had been about human contributions to galactic civilization. For 40 years, human engineers had been quietly improving every piece of Veltari technology. Their ships, their weapons, their buildings, their entire way of life depended on human innovation and human maintenance. Without human support, the Empire was sliding backwards toward a primitive state that none of them remembered how to survive. Their young people had never learned the old ways of living without advanced technology. They did not know how to grow food without automated systems, or how to communicate without quantum networks, or how to travel between stars without human-designed navigation. Computers. Zixera admitted that her people had been fools and begged Dr. Yunji to convince humanity to help them before it was too late. The Aquarian representative spoke next from inside a special water tank that allowed the jellyfish-like creature to attend council sessions. The alien pulsed with colors of deep distress as it described the growing crisis on Aquarian worlds. Their vast underwater cities were becoming poisoned as human-designed filtration systems failed. Billions of Aquarian citizens were getting sick from toxins that human technology had been quietly removing from their water for decades. The Aquarian explained that their species had evolved in perfectly clean ocean environments over millions of years. They had no natural immunity to the industrial pollutants and chemical waste that accumulated in their water systems. Human environmental engineers had created biological filters that broke down these toxins into harmless compounds. Without human technicians to maintain these systems, the Aquarians were facing an extinction-level crisis within months. Even worse, the Aquarians had become completely dependent on human agricultural techniques to feed their massive population. Their native sea plants could only support a fraction of their current numbers. Human scientists had developed new species of kelp and algae that grew much faster and provided better nutrition. These modified plants were now dying off because no one understood how to maintain the complex ecosystem balances that human biologists had carefully created. The plant-based Sylvans were facing the most desperate situation of all. Their representative was an ancient tree-like being whose bark was cracked and whose leaves were turning brown from stress. The Sylvan spoke in a rustling voice about how human genetic modifications had allowed their population to grow far beyond what their planets could naturally support. For 60 years, human botanists had been improving Sylvan crops and developing new farming techniques that could feed billions of plant people. The Sylvans had celebrated this population growth as a sign of their species' success. They had built vast cities and expanded across dozens of worlds, confident that human agricultural science would continue to support their growing numbers. Now, those same populations were facing starvation as human-modified crops failed without proper maintenance. The Sylvans did not know how to return to their old loyal farming methods. Even if they did, their planets could not support more than a tenth of their current population using traditional agriculture. The ancient Sylvan representative estimated that 8 billion of his people would die within the next year if human agricultural support was not restored immediately. One by one, every major species in the council stood to confess their dependence on human innovation. The energy-based conductors admitted that human quantum mathematics kept them stable and prevented them from dissolving into random energy patterns. The insectoid klaxons revealed that human chemical engineering had revolutionized their hive construction techniques. Even the machine intelligences called syntaxics acknowledged that human programming languages had improved their cognitive processing by several 100%. Dr. Yunji listened to hour after hour of desperate confessions from species that had spent decades calling humans primitive and worthless. She felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but she also felt no sympathy for beings who had brought this crisis on themselves through their own arrogance and prejudice. Finally, the prime conductor called for her to address the council, the ancient energy being pulsed with colors of desperation and fear as it begged her to speak on behalf of humanity. Dr. Yunji stood slowly and walked to the center of the great chamber. Every alien eye and sensor and energy field focused on her as she reached the same spot where Ambassador Deho had announced humanity withdrawal 6 months earlier. She looked around at the thousands of desperate faces and spoke in a clear voice that carried easily through the vast space. She told the assembled aliens that they still did not understand what had happened or why humanity had walked away. They thought this was about trade agreements and technology sharing and political representation. They thought they could negotiate some kind of deal that would bring humans back into the galactic community. But this was never about what humans wanted in exchange for their cooperation. This was about respect and recognition and basic fairness. For 50 years, humanity had been treated like children who should be grateful for any attention from their betters. Every human contribution had been dismissed or ignored or credited to alien mentors who had supposedly taught the primitive humans how to think. Dr. Yunji explained that humans had not been learning from alien teachers. Humans had been teaching aliens how to solve problems that had puzzled them for centuries. Every piece of technology that aliens thought they had shared with humanity had actually been improved beyond recognition by human engineers and scientists. She gestured toward the desperate representatives around her and asked them to consider what they were really admitting. They were saying that their entire galactic civilization had been secretly dependent on the species they had called the most primitive and worthless in the galaxy. The Prime Conductor interrupted with a question that everyone had been waiting for. The ancient being asked what humanity wanted and what it would take to restore cooperation between humans and the Council species. Dr. Yunji smiled sadly as she answered. She said the aliens were still asking the wrong question. This was not about what humans wanted. This was about what humans deserved. For 50 years they had been denied basic respect and equal treatment despite contributing more to galactic civilization than any other species. She told the Council that humanity was not interested in returning to the old system where they did all the work while aliens took all the credit. Humans had discovered. 2 years had passed since humanity walked away from the Galactic Council and the galaxy had become a completely different place. What had once been a unified civilization spanning thousands of worlds was now split into 2 separate and very different regions of space. Engineer Jae-wook stood on the observation deck of New Harmony Station looking out through the transparent aluminum windows at the most amazing sight in the galaxy. Ships from dozens of different species were docking at human-built ports, but these were not the same kind of vessels that used to visit Council worlds. These ships belonged to species that had chosen to leave the old Council system and join a growing network of human-allied worlds. The vessels were smaller and more efficient than the massive dreadnoughts favored by Council races. They were built using human engineering principles that emphasized cooperation and mutual benefit rather than domination and control. The rabbit-like Gentari had been the first species to approach humanity after the withdrawal. They were small, peaceful creatures who had always been treated as second-class citizens by the larger Council races. When they heard that humans were forming partnerships based on equality and respect, they immediately sent ambassadors to Earth, asking to join the new alliance. The Gentari brought with them advanced biotechnology that could grow buildings and vehicles from specially engineered plants. When combined with human agricultural science, this technology allowed the construction of entire cities that were completely sustainable and environmentally friendly. The insectoid Cliktari came next, bringing their incredible organizational abilities and hive mind coordination. They had been dismissed by Council species as mindless drones, but humans recognized their collective intelligence as a valuable asset. Working together, human individuals and Cliktari hives could solve complex problems that neither species could handle alone. The crystalline Zephyrians were the most surprising addition to the human alliance. These beings looked like living gems that could change their internal structure to process different types of information. Council races had always been afraid of the Zephyrians because their alien thought processes were difficult to understand. Humans had taken a different approach. Instead of trying to make the Zephyrians think like other species, they had learned to communicate with crystal beings on their own terms. The result was a partnership that revolutionized computer science and data processing throughout human space. Jae-wook himself was one of the engineers responsible for designing the new stations and shipyards that were being built throughout the human alliance. At 35 years old, he had already overseen the construction of 12 major space facilities using techniques that combined the best innovations from all allied species. The station he was standing on was a perfect example of this cooperative approach. The basic structure was built using human engineering principles, but it incorporated Gentari biotechnology for life support systems and Cliktari organizational methods for traffic control and Zephyrian data processing for communication networks. The result was a space station that was more advanced and efficient than anything the old Council had ever built. It could support 1 million beings from dozens of different species while using only a fraction of the resources that Council stations required. Through the windows, Jae-wook could see similar construction projects taking place throughout the local system. New shipyards were building vessels designed by teams of human and alien engineers working together as equals. Research facilities were developing technologies that no single species could have created alone. Agricultural platforms were growing food using techniques that combined human farming science with alien biological knowledge. Captain Yuri had just returned from the most important discovery in galactic history. Her exploration vessel Horizon Walker carried a crew that included humans and representatives from 6 different allied species. Together they had found something that changed everything anyone thought they knew about galactic civilization. Ancient ruins on Kepler 442b were not just old buildings left behind by some forgotten species. They were a message from the very first galactic civilization that had existed millions of years before even the oldest current races had developed. Space Travel. Yuri stood in the briefing room of New Harmony Station describing her discoveries to a mixed audience of human and alien scientists. The ruins contained detailed records of how that ancient civilization had risen and fallen. The story was both fascinating and terrifying in its implications for the current galaxy. The ancient race had tried to build a galactic government based on hierarchy and dominance, just like the current council system. The most powerful species had controlled weaker ones while claiming that this arrangement was natural and beneficial for everyone. They had dismissed younger races as primitive and unworthy of equal treatment. The system had worked for thousands of years until the younger species had finally grown tired of being treated as servants and second-class citizens. They had withdrawn from the galactic government and formed their own alliance based on cooperation and mutual respect. What followed was a period of rapid innovation and expansion as the younger races combined their different strengths and knowledge. They had quickly surpassed the older civilization in technology and organization. Within a few centuries, the old hierarchical system had collapsed completely, leaving behind only ruins and warnings for future civilizations. The ancient records contained detailed technical information about technologies that were far beyond anything the current galaxy had achieved, but more importantly, they contained a clear message about the only way to build a truly stable and successful galactic civilization. True galactic unity could only exist when all species were treated as equals, regardless of their age or appearance or cultural differences. Any system based on the assumption that some races were naturally superior to others was doomed to eventual collapse. Captain Yuri explained that the ancient ruins also contained something else. Hidden in the deepest chambers were manufacturing facilities that could produce technologies beyond current understanding. The ancient race had left behind the tools needed to build the kind of galactic civilization they had failed to create themselves, but there was a catch. The manufacturing systems would only activate for a civilization that had learned to cooperate as equals. The ancient security systems could somehow detect whether a species was truly committed to equality or just pretending in order to gain access to advanced technology. Back on Earth, President So-young was preparing for the most important speech of her career. She stood before the United Human Assembly, but this time she was not alone. Representatives from 43 different allied species stood with her, representing the first truly equal galactic government in millions of years. Contrast with the old council system could not have been more obvious. Instead of a few dominant species controlling hundreds of subordinate ones, the human alliance was built on the principle that every member had an equal voice regardless of their size or age or military power. The Gentari ambassador was no bigger than a human child, but her opinions carried the same weight as representatives from much larger species. The Cliktari hive mind spoke for billions of individuals, but accepted the same single vote as species with much smaller populations. Even the newest members who had just achieved space travel were given full participation in all decisions. President So-young began her speech by acknowledging the representatives from all allied species. She spoke about how the past 2 years had proven that cooperation was more powerful than domination. The human alliance had achieved more technological and social progress in 24 months than the council system had managed in the previous century. She announced that the alliance was ready to take the next step in galactic evolution. Using the ancient technologies discovered on Kepler 442b, they would begin construction of a new type of civilization that could support billions of beings from hundreds of different species in true equality and prosperity. But first they had to deal with the remnants of the old system. The original Galactic Council still existed, but it was a shadow of its former self. Most of the council worlds were experiencing various levels of social and economic collapse. The Veltari Empire had lost over half its territory as crystal cities crumbled and populations fled to more stable regions. The Theranin military had been reduced to a fraction of its former size as their advanced weapons systems failed without human maintenance. The Aquarians were facing extinction as their polluted oceans continued to deteriorate. The Sylvans had lost billions of their people to starvation as their modified crops failed. Even the ancient conductors were slowly fading away as they lost the quantum mathematical knowledge needed to maintain their energy forms. Some of the more pragmatic council species had already begun sending secret diplomatic missions to human alliance worlds. They were quietly asking about the possibility of joining the new system if they could prove their commitment to equality and cooperation. The Veltari ambassador turned to the prime conductor with a question that everyone in the old council chambers who had been thinking about for months. She asked if it was too late for the council species to join the human alliance and abandon their failing hierarchical system, the ancient energy.